Okay, good morning. I know it's not early in the morning, it's a bit later in the morning. As you can tell, I don't work out and I don't look like Thor, so we'll start off with that. But I am very thankful to be here, and welcome to all of you. But more importantly, I would say to Omid, really thank you for welcoming me. This is really a new opportunity. I'm not an oncologist, and nor do I get to enjoy the interactions with all of you, as well as the space you're in terms of the exciting therapies. The question then is, why am I here? And I'll hopefully make that case to you in just a second. This is a bit by way of my disclosures. I do clinical trials in pregnancy, and really there's no better place, I would imagine, where a partnership is critical as it is in taking care of pregnant patients. I hope that the field of therapies for complications in pregnancies reaches to the point where you are today in melanoma. Hopefully it won't take us 10 years, but that's what I spend my life doing. I've consulted certainly for biotech and large pharma. I get some patents and royalties based on some of the things we've discovered. I consult for the FDA, not in oncology, but in cardiology and kidney diseases. And I used to coordinate the clinical trial office at Partners, which are the major Harvard hospitals, and I coordinated the clinical trials there for many years. So really, it's with that perspective that I come to you on this fine morning. So I am not here to redefine what otherwise might be considered the doctor-patient relationship, but I will posit to you that that is not what we should be continuing to discuss. We should be actually discussing the doctor-patient partnership, or probably better said, I would say, the patient-doctor partnership. And as Jennifer and others will talk about, probably the patient-team partnership. Now, the reason why all of you are here is because of that partnership, and there are places in this country that exemplify that partnership, such as the Angeles Clinic. And that's really what I'm going to speak to you about today, because none of these changes, as you heard earlier, would have been possible without, in a sense, that partnership. My goal, or goals I should say, at Cedars Sinai, I've been there for about a year, really is to foster collaborations. It's to foster collaborations between our physicians, with our graduate students, with our researchers, but most importantly, and as exemplified by this morning's talks, which have been really incredible, this collaboration with our patients, with our partners. And only by doing so can we actually make the differences that each of you are benefiting from today. So historically, right, the medical profession has been in a position where we would define research as that which is done on patients rather than with patients. And each of you are examples of the opposite, right? It's with patients. And that interaction is a special interaction. It's one when you come to the clinic, whether you come to Cedars Sinai or the Angeles Clinic, or really for any affiliated institution we have, you come with that sort of promissory note, right? The note being, when you come in, you're offered the best clinical care, and when that best clinical care is either not available or can be improved or is slightly inferior, then your expectation, and has been delivered, by the way, is that you get access to clinical studies. And that is the partnership, again, that has led to some of these incredible discoveries. I've spoken many times about patients being our partners in clinical care and discovery back at Harvard, and I'm realizing that that is a universal theme for success, and we'll touch upon this. Now, one can ask the question, really, where does that partnership begin? And as we began this morning, and as Omid highlighted, right, we're here to talk about research and the major advances, as well as what, as a community, this clinic and all of you are doing. But there have been quite a few publications in terms of highlighting the fact that that partnership exists at many different stages, in fact, at all stages of a clinical research project. That partnership begins before even a study has commenced. A discussion and an open discussion about what opportunities exist, identifying research priorities. The patient involvement exists during a study, and each of you who have been in studies know that. What are you experiencing? What are the side effects? What are the benefits? What's wrong with the study? Why can't it be better? What else can be done? And that partnership and patient involvement doesn't end because there's a significant amount of intervention, if you will, after the study, right? Informing participants about study results, understanding patients' experiences as part of that study. So that continuum is that contract that each of you has and continues to have, if you will, with your caregivers. Now, I've done some work in the area of trying to understand why clinicians feel patients don't want to participate in clinical research. And I'll just use some examples. This is some work done by a colleague of mine looking at the myths and realities of clinical trial involvement among underrepresented minorities. Here's the myth. The Tuskegee syphilis study is the reason why underrepresented minorities don't participate in clinical research. In fact, just the opposite. When you actually interview African Americans, they acknowledge it, but that doesn't stop them from participating in research. Trial participants are guinea pigs and may be experimented on in ways beyond their consent. Well, the rules and regulations today prevent us from taking advantage of patients and, more importantly, ensuring that there's that partnership, that contract, whether they be federal rules or even local rules. Clinical trials are or should be an option only when potential participants have no other options. As you heard so many times this morning, even though the therapies have been incredible, there's opportunities to improve. Omid, just before me, talked about that greed, right? That greed to make actually things better. Some clinical trial participants will receive treatment inferior to standard of care. Well, that's not the case. And so these myths are simply that. They're myths, and more importantly, when you actually dive into the information and begin to talk to patients and begin to understand their needs, you realize, in fact, that there is truly a disconnect. So, I will first start off also, I should have mentioned this before, I'm not going to show you pictures of cells or curves or poop, I apologize on that. But I'm going to just show you some general data about clinical research, and then we'll talk about philanthropy in just a minute. So here's an interesting survey where a company, in this case Eli Lilly, went out and gave surveys to physicians as well as to patients they cared for in oncology and asked the question, was there a connect or a disconnect between those two parties? Well, most often, as you can imagine, and the reason I'm showing you these data is because it's usually a disconnect, and here are some examples of that. So doctors are a patient's preferred source for clinical trial information. What a surprise, right? When you actually survey doctors, they don't believe that to be the case, and when you survey patients, half the patients say they would actually prefer to get information from their doctors. Well, who else among the ancillary staff are going to give information? Well, that actually has grown, I would say, today. But patients have spoken, and patients have said, you know what, it's appreciated when my doctor speaks to me. But here's even some more examples of a disconnect, which I thought, again, in oncology trials, to be quite surprising. So once again, you survey physicians, and you survey patients, and the red highlights the percent of patients acknowledging that's a problem, and in the yellow or mustard color are the survey responses of physicians. And here's a perfect example of a disconnect. Clinicians say that patients don't participate in clinical trials because of fear of side effects. 61% of the physicians said that. 14% of the patients said that. Complete disconnect. Physicians say that patients don't participate in trials because of a fear of placebo. 67% of doctors said that. 10% of patients say that. Complete disconnect. Relocation, patients don't want to be relocated, the burden for them. Again, all of these numbers on top represent the physician's understanding, or at least what they believe to be the case as to why patients don't participate in studies. And every number below that, which highlights the fact that it is not a barrier to participate coming from the patient perspective. So that disconnect is a perception, interestingly enough, more often from the physician standpoint than from the patient standpoint, as is highlighted. Now, Mike Davies talked about some changes at the FDA, and again, by way of disclosure, I consult for the FDA, but not in the oncology space. But this wave is happening in many different diseases, in many different areas in the FDA. In oncology, just recently, the FDA put out a mandate to take steps to broaden the patient population in cancer clinical trials, advancing policies to promote inclusion of pediatric patients, patients with HIV, the LGBTQ community. That's a mandate by the FDA. I was at a panel meeting for the FDA for another agent, not in oncology, a few weeks ago. And what we asked the sponsor was, how inclusive have you been? And you heard this morning a lovely presentation on historically patients with brain metastases not being included. You heard about certain populations necessarily being excluded. And that is changing from the top. This is the regulatory environment. In fact, the most common reason why patients are excluded is because companies feel that by including patients with different variations of the disease, that their results may be different than the general population. And their goal, of course, is to rush and try to get a therapy into the market as soon as possible. And the last thing they need is heterogeneity. The last thing they need is some arm responding differently than another arm, some arm having a side effect than the usual arm. But importantly, the conversations now at the level of the FDA are, we want that heterogeneity. We want to know when this therapy gets to the patient population, that all patients who potentially can benefit have the opportunity to benefit. And so one of the recommendations that we made at the FDA was not to penalize the companies when they are inclusive. And that's very different, because as you can imagine, their goal is safety. And so it's a partnership with the FDA, but interestingly enough, at that FDA meeting I was at, when we were encouraging the FDA, one, to be more inclusive, and two, not to penalize companies for including that heterogeneity, were patient advocates, people like yourselves, not in the audience, at the round table, screaming and yelling and stomping their feet for better inclusion and greater participation. And again, that's why this field has changed. So in the first part of my talk, I've certainly highlighted a partnership in research and a major disconnect with physicians. But that partnership, as I highlighted, this clinic, the hospital across the street, you'll see more and more of, and as a result, the successes that each of you have enjoyed. For the next part of my talk, I'm going to talk about another partnership, which is what's the history of philanthropy in this partnership of medical discovery and medical advances. And to highlight that, let me just give you a bit of background. So at Cedars Sinai today, there's almost 500 clinical trials. Most of those trials are in the space of heart disease. And you see the second largest one, of course, is in cancer. And I am sure at the next meeting, Omid is going to challenge me on this, and he's going to put up another figure to highlight the fact that cancer clinical trials at Angeles as well as elsewhere will and has and also will exceed, if you will, the trials in every other space, as it probably should. Now, at Cedars Sinai, interestingly enough, we enjoy, or at least are the beneficiary of funding from the federal government. Our federal government trials support for research continues to go up. As a single standing hospital, not affiliated with a university or a medical school, we actually stand among the top 10 of institutions around the country. We are the beneficiary of federal funding. And if you look at the federal funding at Cedars Sinai, more and more of that funding now is in the space of human diseases, or I should say human studies, and less so in animal studies. That's not to say that the animal studies aren't important. You heard many of the studies, as a result of you benefiting from them, have started in the animal world. But thanks to people like Omid and Mark and others, we realize that doing studies in humans is the contract we have with our patients. We offer them the best clinical care and the best opportunities to participate in research. Okay, so this is an exciting area to be in, meaning grants and research and trials and so forth. What's happening actually at the national level, and what's likely to happen moving forward? So no surprise, FY19 spending proposals from the NIH, so the NIH's budget, of course, in the research world, we're always pushing for more, and as you can imagine, some are pushing for less. The red represents the less, that's on the left side, that's the presidential proposal, and on the right is the House and the Senate, which are pushing for more. And this yin and yang has continued over the last few years. So, where did we end up in 2019? We actually ended up with more funding to the NIH, despite the president's push for less funding to the NIH. And again, those kinds of advantages help us, of course, do the studies we have. Now, what's going to happen moving forward? And here on the top is the curve for NIH appropriations in current and constant dollars. So this is inflation adjusted. We can just ignore this for a second, but these are actual dollars. We're up at 39.3, or just about 40 billion. As a result of this recent increase, the push by the scientific communities go up to 41 billion. And by the way, the NCI is the largest beneficiary of that. And the presidential proposal is to go down to 34. Now, you can argue this is posturing, or maybe there's a reallocation of funds for other priorities, which I won't get into. So this battle will go on at the national level over the next year. And the question, of course, who will win? Now, I should say, again, by way of disclosure, the NCI has been an incredible beneficiary of the NIH budget. And as a result, the therapies that many of which you saw today have been tried and tested. But at what point does federal dollars, or at what point do federal dollars make a difference? Because historically, the NIH and the NCI have funded studies that, in general, are risk averse, in general, have been incremental, and in general, have been predictable. Taking a risk is not something the NIH likes to do. But the therapies that you saw, and those Kaplan-Meier curves that I didn't show you, but the others have shown you, have not been because of risk-averse attitudes and incremental attitudes and predictable attitudes. They've been because of risk-taking and bold decision-making and partnerships with patients. It's a high-risk venture. But without that, we wouldn't have these therapies today. And that's not to say that the NCI has not participated in these studies, but they didn't begin these studies. They began with investigators and people like Omid and Mark and others who said, let's push the envelope in areas that we just don't have enough good treatments for. It hasn't come necessarily by the NCI and the NIH. Now, I will confess, the head of the NCI, Ned Sharpless, is a classmate of mine, and I certainly wouldn't say this if he was in the room, but that said, he acknowledges this, and the NCI acknowledges this. But what's moved the needle? So I'm going to show you an example of a press release from my former institution. So this is a press release from the Mass General Hospital where I was for 26 years. just a few weeks ago, we're thrilled to let you know that the MGH has received the largest gift in history, $200 million, to support the Reagan Institute, which is an institute at MGH and MIT. The gift comes from the Reagan family, longtime supporters of the hospital, whose transformational contribution will ensure the institute has resources in the decades ahead. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that a gift this size is required. It just goes to show that in this day and age, people acknowledge that gifts in general and philanthropy in general are transformational. And what I'd like to share with you is why in the last few minutes. So, the NIH budget, as I mentioned to you, at $40 billion is not trivial. When it first began in the 1950s as an appropriation, it started off at $3 million. And then it grew 30 million, 300 million. Today we're at 30 plus, almost $40 billion. That's been a tremendous growth. It's been flat over many years, and yes, at the scientific community we continue to push. About a month ago I was at Capitol Hill meeting with Dianne Feinstein's office and Kamala Harris's office, advocating for further research dollars, pushing for the NIH budget. I was, of course, advocating for more research in pregnant patients because I think they're completely ignored. But that said, all fronts needed an infusion. Now, if you look historically, the NIH has funded investigators, but they usually fund established investigators because you have a panel of reviewers that some of us here sit on in these committees, and we look at grants and we say, who's likely to deliver? Well, the best metric of who's going to deliver is somebody who's delivered before. The problem with that is that we don't give chance for something new to come into the field. So we tend to fund what we know, what people have done, and we tend to fund, in general, what's incremental. We tend to fund things that are risk averse. Now, one argument could be made, and that is that everybody or anyone can submit grants to the NIH or to the Department of Defense. And as a result, the field is level. But we all know you're more likely to get funded if you're a senior investigator and if you've been funded before and if you're in the field, if you've been in the field for a long time. How does support in philanthropy differ? Well, on the one hand, the criticism has come forward, and that is it tends to go to large institutions because somebody wants to give a donation to MIT and MGH and have their name affiliated with that. But that said, when you look across the board, in general, philanthropy, rightfully so, has said, let's fund studies and research that are more risky. Let's fund studies that are more proximal to the patient. Yes, it's important to study mice, and no one disagrees with that, because some of the T-cell therapies that you heard about and immune checkpoint therapies all came from animal studies. But when philanthropists get into the game, they insist on making a difference in their lifetimes to patients, and so they insist on those funds being allocated to translational research. The criticism is that maybe by just giving money to either an organization or an investigator that there's really no scientific review of the proposal, and that's usually false, because it turns out that people who give are incredibly smart, and if they don't know what they're getting into, they get the right people to assess the quality of that research, and that we're seeing more and more. They are more likely to fund diseases of special interest to them, yes, who can blame them, right? I mean, and as a result, we see major advances in diseases that otherwise aren't being touched by the NIH. And they love the risk. They love the challenge. Now, there have been some pretty large gifts, and the purpose of showing you some of these slides, whether it's the Theodore Stanley gifts to the Broad Institute at MIT, all the way to Bill and Melinda Gates and Paul Allen. I mean, these are sort of household names. But the point isn't to say that these are the most transformational gifts. Most of the gifts are small because they move the needle a little bit. And the reason they have to move the needle a little bit is because the federal funding and companies want to come in after the risk has been reduced. So show us data that demonstrates that this drug will have an effect. Show us data that the patients are going to get a little bit better. And when that risk is reduced and the side effect profile has been addressed, that's when you can actually get money from companies and from the government and so forth. But how do you get into this space? Well, that's where philanthropy has made the biggest difference. And it turns out to be in some of these phase studies, phase 1 and phase 2 studies. And that's in this environment where we're seeing philanthropy moving the needle tremendously. So at what stage? Well, philanthropy, many are able and willing to provide seed money for phase 1 and phase 2 trials. And this money then is used, and these are not large dollars, this money is then used to attract additional support and to kickstart programs that otherwise would not have been kickstarted. Partnerships between private philanthropic foundations and medical research institutes have the potential to transform the world. Moving forward, venture philanthropies will play an increasing role. That's a new word in this landscape, venture philanthropy. And in the last minute or so, I'm just going to highlight what that is as a perfect example. So venture philanthropy sort of sits in this middle space. Philanthropy on the left side of the equation are charities, March of Dimes, United Way, and so forth. These charities give money to people, to organizations, to groups to kickstart research. But it's a hands-off approach with no expectation of return other than a commitment to continue that research. On the right side of the equation are those individuals, companies that insist on a financial return. That is, the reason they're in this business is a financial return. That's not the charity on the left, it's the business on the right. But there's this space in the middle called venture philanthropy, which is another partnership between those giving the money and those receiving the money, saying, we're going to partner with you, we're going to hold you accountable, and we're going to expect a return on our investment, and we're going to follow that return. And in the last 10 years, I would say there's really no better example for this than in cystic fibrosis. And let me just highlight this for you, and then I'll end. So the cystic fibrosis story is just an incredible story, because the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which is in Bethesda, Maryland, had been for many years giving money to investigators and institutions and said, we don't have therapies for cystic fibrosis. Well, the chairman of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the mid to late 90s had raised money from families and said, we're not just going to continue giving it to universities and getting that money eaten up. And yes, there were some incremental changes. But it's unbelievable because cystic fibrosis, by the late 90s, we knew the gene, we knew the defect, we had a patient population. All we were waiting for was necessarily a drug. And so what Beal, who was the chairman at the time, he just stepped down, and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation did is they found a company, and they said, we're going to give you $30 million, and your return is going to be identification of 2 to 3 compounds. So they took cells, just like you heard about today, from patients with cystic fibrosis, and they gave it to this company called Aurora Biosciences or Pharmaceuticals. And Aurora, using robots and patient cells, tested dozens and dozens of compounds and actually came up with some compounds that modified the defect. And what happened since then? Remember, it was a $30 million investment, and the promissory note was to give them an extra $16 million if they met some milestones. But that wasn't to fund the large clinical trials. Those cost $500 million. That has to be done by large companies. In the late 1990s, the mandate was by the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation is we're not going to let you go. We're not just going to give you the money. We're going to insist. We're going to meet you 2 to 3 times a year. We want reports. We want updates. And we're taking a financial stake in this. They wanted equity, or at least a royalty in this game, if you will. So what happened? Aurora identified 2 or 3 compounds, and in 2001, 2002, Vertex Pharmaceuticals bought all those compounds from Aurora. Vertex, then, large pharmaceutical company, with their muscle, was able to take a discovered compound and make it a drug. Toxicity studies, trials, and so forth. Escalated those drugs for particular gene defects in cystic fibrosis, went to the FDA, did trials, got those drugs approved, and the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, by way of royalties for a $30 to $40 million investment, got back on their return $3 billion. Just think about that. Now, of course, it's nice to say, it doesn't happen frequently, but that was the point. That is, we are philanthropists, but we're also in it to make sure we get a return. And to the credit of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, they went back to the community and said, we're not going to take that money and fill our pockets. We're going to take all that money that we get and we're going to reinvest it back into more research. And so they stimulated a drug for pancreatic disease and cystic fibrosis, infection for cystic fibrosis, and licensed those out. If today you go to the tax forms of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, they only have about $100 million in cash, despite all of that return, because every time they got a return, they put it back into research. Very different model, and one that people use as a case study in terms of a better partnership and a better mandate to moving therapies forward. Now, today, by the way, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, yes, they bring in products and they license out products and they kickstart products, but they have also been the major champion of the clinical trials network for cystic fibrosis. So if today you wanted to do a trial in cystic fibrosis, you go to the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation and they have 80 centers around the country that are in turnkey operation can start a clinical trial. So they have expanded this in ways that no one would have imagined. So I'm going to end and say, in the second part of this discussion, right, philanthropic support is not meant to replace federal funding, but it has allowed our community to take risks, and those risks have translated to some incredible discoveries, many of which you enjoy. They have allowed young investigators with fresh ideas, again, high-risk endeavors, to be funded. And in the right setting, with the right relationship, whether it's the Reagan Institute, who decided to fund HIV research, or the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation as big examples, you can avoid sort of this political football. So I'll end by saying the following, and that is that, first of all, I looked up the word Omid, and Omid in Persian means hope. And I think you've heard that from him and the rest of this community today. The second thing I'll say is that the partnership would not be possible without you. The vector of change is you, right? Because of you, these advances took place. Because of patients, because of advocates, because of champions, changes in medicine took place. When I started in medicine, it was a very different world, and I don't need to tell you what we were doing for patients with melanoma or doing with patients with heart disease and diabetes and so forth. We're in a very different world. But, as Omid said, the greed is going to force us to go to the next step and the next meeting and the next therapy and a better outcome. Thank you.